Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. As you can see, we are still somewhere other than the studio, unfortunately. Which also, of course, means regrettably you're still stuck with just me. Chris and Brian aren't going to be available. We're still working on that. I want to say in particular, and I've said this to them already, and on my Facebook, but one of my favorite channels, which is Non Sequitur Show, has been going through a whole meltdown because of what Kyle did to Steve. And Steve, if you happen to listen to this, I'm totally, still totally supporting you. Um, that's not happening here. Chris and Brian have a place on the show. Technical problems are the only, if we could figure out the technical problems now, they'd be here with me. Um, but I wanted, the show must go on, as they say, and here we are. Tonight we're going to be talking. I'm going to be starting what I think is going to be a series about the witch trials. I'm going to try and go over some of the history, some of the motivations. I've talked about it before, but I want to do a bigger, wider topic, starting with where the origins of the idea come from in the ancient world. Because believe it or not, the idea of criminal prosecution of someone for witchcraft predates Christianity. And we're going to get into that in a minute. I'm going to talk about the witch trials, of course, of the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. When actually a lot of it's worth saying, a lot of the witch hunts, especially the ones everyone thinks of, are really more products of there's the early and late Middle Ages, or AKA the Dark Ages, in the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance and the Reformation and all that. A lot of the actual witch hunts come later. They're not really products of the Dark Ages. Not to say it never happened, but well, we'll get into all of that as time goes on. Um, and a lot of what people think they know about the witch trials may not be as accurate as they think it is. That's kind of one of the reasons for doing this. On the other hand, I think it's important to say witch trials, unfortunately, are not a thing of the past. Um, for one thing, there are witch hunts going on in the world today. Not in the United States. Not They don't burn people at the stake in the United States so much, thankfully. Nor did they ever actually. But they are taking place in parts of Africa and the Middle East. New Guinea's seen some, and other places like that. Um, Often and we're gonna talk about those probably in the second or third episode. So depending on how far this goes, but suffice to say, in those cases, a lot of the times, it's not that they're executed, although that does happen. It's more usually that they're kicked out. And where are my manners? There's somebody I wanted to. Okay, so before I get in, then there's the other type of modern witch trials I want to get into, which is actually what inspired me to do these videos. So, a channel that I watch by the name of Lisa for Truth has been doing a series called The Satanic Panic. The Satanic Panic very much was a modern U.S. witch hunt, along with the other major modern U.S. witch hunt, which would be McCarthyism. Actually, for that matter, another as controversial as it is, but you see elements of the witch hunts in some aspects of pedophile, the way that people hunt for pedophiles. And we're going to get into all of that as we go down the road. Don't mistake me and think I'm saying that pedophiles are not. Pedophiles are a thing, and they deserve to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. In fact, maybe the law should be a little harder on them. But that's in the future. But I do highly recommend checking out Lisa for Truth's video. For that matter, I've got a new, and I've mentioned this on Facebook, but I've got a new Kevin Soapbox video in the works. I'm currently talking to Source the Skeptic about maybe collaborating, because it was inspired by a recent video of his that just made me want to punch something. So I thought we both would have something useful to bring to the table. That'll be. I'll get into more about that when I see if he is in fact going to be available to join me, and down the road. Needless to say, Well, it's by no means my intention to make Kevin's soapbox videos. Kevin's pissed off about something. Let's rant and rave about it. So far, they're all good. They're going that way. I mean, the first one about the Make America Straight Again conference was as pissed off as I've been in a long time. And the next topic, I mean, the middle topic between the two about my own faith was nice and mellow and just me talking about what I believe. But this next topic, oh, you think Christians talking about how we should kill homosexuals makes me mad, and it does. But you ain't seen how mad I get. This really, there are just things you don't do in too many states. 48 of them, thankfully not the state I'm in now, are doing horror. Have legalized something absolutely horrible. But that's the future. Tonight, like I said, the topic is witch hunts. So the first thing I want to kind of cover about the witch hunt, the idea of a witch hunt, is it's older than people think. The thing, people have this notion, and it's a very modern notion, that magic and paganism, or specifically magic was always accepted in the ancient world, that various tribal cultures and pagans accepted the people who practiced it, and were cool with it, and then Judaism to some extent, then Christianity came along and dropped the giant hammer on the whole thing, smashed everybody's toys, and said, "Nope, you're of the devil. You have to be burned." That's not accurate. Even a lot of some of the concepts you see in the witch trials started much earlier. But let's follow the logic of what I'm talking about here. First thing to realize is out, most primitive societies, and for that matter, most ancient legal codes, differentiate between two types of magic. What anthropologists, in fact, would call might call the shamanic traditions and the shamans. And I'm sorry for any Wiccans and neo pagans out there listening in, but what in anthropology is generally called the witch, or witch doctrine, which is another way of putting it. But you have the shaman and the witch doctor who practice magic for the good of the tribe. They're usually a religious figure, the equivalent of a priest. They communicate with the spirits. They find out ways to heal people. They wind up dispelling curses that are cast on people. They wind up casting out evil spirits that are inflicting people. That type of magic is existed for a very long time and has always been seen as socially acceptable. What you might call, though it's a simplification, really, I think, white magic. Interestingly enough, and we're going to get into this tonight, I think, the church even makes this distinction too, at least historically. Now, on the other hand, you have black magic, or what again, anthropologists in the Middle Ages would call a witch. Whereas the shaman is a public figure, everyone knows who they are. People come to them for help. The witch would be someone outcast, somebody on the side, the outside outlier of society. If people may know of them, or they may work in secret, depending on the tradition and the story. They do magic for their own sake. They curse people. They do other. They work. They truck with dark spirits. They do other things that they come summon up storms and things like that. They do things that work against the good of the tribe. In fact, one of the main purposes a witch doctor or a shaman serves is to counter that magic. Um, and again, this is something you see this like if you look in one of the what is a modern version of one of the oldest religions in the world, voodoo. There's the idea of a hongan or a mamaloha, who is a priest. Hongan's a priest, and a mamaloha is a priestess, doing magic for the good of the tribe. But there's also a bokor, and when you think about the classic voodoo doll, sticking pins to curse people. When you think of zombies, that's the bokor. Not there's this distinction. In law, this distinction is actually pretty clearly made more than once throughout history, particularly the what's generally recognized, though, as I understand it, having researched this a while back, it's they've since found older ones, but what's widely considered the oldest codified set of laws in history, which is the Code of Hammurabi, um, which calls upon the Babylonian deity Marduk, um, but it has provisions for punishing someone who practices magic. Specifically, it's and this is what's interesting, and this is what holds true for a lot of history. The code doesn't condemn people just for practicing magic. They condemn what you do with magic. You know, if for example you're casting a spell to make your crops go faster, that's not illegal. Casting the spell to blight your neighbor's crops, to kill your neighbor, to make them sick, make their children die, whatever, that was what the law was concerned with. And you see, again, this is pretty common in the ancient world. In Judaism, there is some degree of this idea. Technically, of course, there's "Thou shalt not suffer which to live" in the Bible, but it's worth saying that that verse is probably not talking about witches in the sense that modern people think. I'm setting aside translation because I don't know. I mean, the word used in Hebrew is kafesh, which is generally translatable as sorcerer. Um, on the other hand, it also can be translated more specifically, possibly as poisoner. Um, the thing with that there, though, being it's definitely meaning negative magic designed to hurt someone. Um, on the other hand, you do find the Jewish tradition of Kabbalah, which involves what can be considered magical practice and forms a large basis of Western ceremonial magic, but it's done very much in keeping with the Bible and is based on biblical concepts. And in fact, if you're going to study Kabbalah, you're expected to be of a certain age and be very conversant in the Torah. But again, there's this duality concept, and the big place where this comes into play would be the Romans. Although I wanted to point out as well, if you look at Greek mythology, um, again, modern people, when you think of many modern people, particularly neo-pagans and Wiccans, when you think of witches in a historical sense, they come out. I don't want to say it just because it's a little insensitive, but they sort of, particularly in the ancient world, almost come out like Glinda the Good. They're goody two shoes. They're positive figures trying to help people and worshiping the gods and all of that. Yeah, check your Greek mythology. Look at Circe. It's the name probably the most infamous sorceress in the Greek world. Um, there is definitely, not to say all forms of magic in Greek mythology are evil, but there is definitely this idea of people who practice magic who are dangerous and not to be trusted, usually not quite human. There's at least some versions of the legend where Circe is demigoddess or some type of nymph, I believe. Um, but again, there's an appeal to the gods, and there's this idea of magic. There's another big difference I think you find is a lot of the times the shaman or the witch doctor is working with the spirits the tribe worships or the gods the tribe worships, as opposed to somebody who's working with the other things. Um, Magic itself is certainly a very old thing. You can find the oldest grimoires, the oldest books of magic, go all the way back to Babylon and Samaria. Um, but reasonably enough, they're generally positive magic, how to keep away demons and things of that nature. But at any rate, the point I'm trying to get to in my usual roundabout fashion, is the question of Rome. Now, Rome, before the Christians took over, outlawed the practice of magic. In particular, in fact, Christians were executed by the Romans for practicing magic. Well, they were executed for a number of things, and this is significant to the larger narrative I'm discussing here. Um, Early Christians were accused of cannibalism, sacrificing children. Um, they were accused of practicing black magic, having truck with demons, weird sexual rites, and things of that nature. What makes all that very interesting is if you know a little bit about about history, these charges we keep coming up. In the witch trials, the witches were accused of black magic and truck with demons and cannibalism and murder and the sacrificing of children. Even biblically, the Jews talked about the worshippers of Moloch passing their children into the fire to kill them and sacrificing them to their god. Um, you have these recurring charges. For that matter, even in the modern day, some of the communists were accused of some of these things. Muslims are accused of some of these things. There seems to be pedophilia is another common one of these charges. The Knights Templar, we're going to get into because, good heavens, we're talking about your historical witch hunts, um, were accused of these things. There's a common, there seems to be, at least to me, a common shared set of sins or crimes that people like to label the other with. By the other, I mean whoever is unpopular in society. Jews were yet another example of some of these, many of these crimes were attributed to them. Um, it's a way of demonizing that group. It is a way of um, rallying people. And, oh, we have to burn the witches. They're going to steal your children. They're going to murder them in the name of Satan. You have to stop the communists. They're, they eat the flesh. They engage in bizarre rites. There is even, and here's the thing: there's even a degree of truth to some of these charges, or in some cases, they're charges that aren't true now but were true at one time. For example, in the Middle Ages, there's a very common idea during which trials of what they called the bacchanal. A bacchanal was a giant orgy where sex and drugs and alcohol and food in this worship of this um, deity. The Romans called him Bacchus, the Greeks called him Dionysus. Bacchus slash Dionysus wasn't evil, but he wasn't the most cuddly of deities necessarily, particularly when you keep in mind his most famous worshippers were a group of women known as the Maenads. And the Maenads, after these bacchanals, like to get together and rip roar across the countryside and find men and tear them limb from limb. Is this really, and there's some, this something like this, and I'm not quite saying it went that far, but something like this may have happened at some point. And the Christian, let's face it, the Christian monks, who are the source of a lot of the stories about witches, were also the ones doing the translations of the ancient Greek and Roman texts. It's like, well, they did it then, they must be doing it now. Um, there's also a fundamental thing that there are certain charges that immediately make people cringe. Saying someone's a murderer is bad. Nobody, I'm certainly not going to claim so. But then you turn around and say, not only is he killing people, he devours them. He eats their flesh. That's an inherent squick factor. Um, Cannibalism is not in all societies. There's some societies that see it differently, have seen it differently in the past. Generally speaking, cannibalism is seen as something horrible. It's seen as something monstrous, inhuman. Um, but so that inherent squick people have, they take advantage of it. Because the thing you'll find with a lot of witch trials throughout history is they tend to serve political reasons. Um, The Inquisition, for a great example of this is the Spanish Inquisition. Um, keep in mind when people talk about the Inquisition, one, the Inquisition wasn't actually all that interested in witches. They were later in the tale, but particularly when it started, its job was to hunt heretics, Christians who claimed teachings that were different than the churches. Um, and ironically enough, while the church's opinion on this goes back and forth through history, there are a number of times in the history of the Roman Catholic Church that the very idea that someone was a witch was a minor form of heresy, because specifically the powers that were assigned to witches, the ability to summon up storms and blight cattle. Saint Augustine of Hippo and many church leaders through history have seen the simple idea that humans could do that as ridiculous. Like, no, humans can't do that. Satan can't do that. God is the only being that could do these things. To even suggest otherwise is giving too much power to something. And the reasons why that changed are heavily political. Um, and we're going to get into that. And the reason why the witch hunts happened. Granted, the thing to understand about why did witch hunts happen is it very much depends on which witch hunt you're talking, which witch is which, as they say, but which hunt are you talking about? Because if we're talking about the early witch hunts in the quote unquote dark ages, as often as not, the church wasn't heavily involved. Um, People gathered, townspeople would gather up and do it. If the Inquisition did get involved in a number of recorded cases, the Inquisition freed the witch and put the people who made the accusation in prison. Again, because of the idea of a witch was heresy. Um, that did change, and again, we're getting there. I'm trying to lay groundwork. Um, but if you're talking about the later witch trials of Europe, they're very political. Um, if you're talking about the Inquisition, it's extremely political. Because here's the thing: there isn't one Inquisition. People talk about the Spanish Inquisition for good reason, because it was of the many various Inquisitions, like the Roman Inquisition, for example. The Spanish was by far the most extreme. The ones that most got into torture, the ones most people were burned. And again, its main concern wasn't witches or anyone that it thought was practicing magic. Its concern was mostly with Jews and Muslims living in Spain at the time that threatened the power of the king and queen. It was the king and queen who, as I understand, who appointed Torquemada, the infamous chief inquisitor, and in many ways they strongly called and approved of the use of torture during the Inquisition. Um, and that's a whole thing into itself. Is that, yeah, there's an undeniable religious component to all of this, but it isn't always as overtly religious. When you get down, it's often overtly religious, but when you get down into the details, it's more complicated. That when we eventually get to the Salem witch trials, for example, that there was a religious element. There are a number of people that got involved with it because they thought it was a true religious call to get rid of the witches. But the people that made the accusations and the people that were accused had something else going on. The accusations weren't random. They certainly weren't of people actually practicing magic, because if anyone has that bizarre idea, because I have run into it before, you can get that out of your head. They weren't. Um, but there was a financial motive behind it, and that's true of a lot of the other witch hunts. That there were financial reasons why these kinds of things happened. Let's consider one of the most famous of the early witch hunts, which is the execution of the Knights of Templar. For those of you who slept through history class, the Knights of Templar were a group of warriors that started in the 14th century. Or, excuse me, let me double check that. Okay, I'm sorry. That's 13th century, with the purpose of protecting pilgrims en route to the Holy Land. They were an important part of some of the Crusades. Let's see. I'm trying to get an exact date. They took oaths of loyalty. They took oaths of poverty. And here's a critical point: they took an oath of poverty. Individual members of this order weren't allowed have to accumulate wealth. Um, this is where it became a problem because a lot of nobles, you know, don't liked what they were doing because they want to protect these innocent pilgrims trying to make journeys to Holy Land, and there wasn't legitimate threat. Okay, 1118. So okay, Christian armies captured Jerusalem in 1099 from Muslim control during the Crusades. A group of pilgrims from across Western Europe starts visiting the Holy Land. Many of them were robbed and killed as they crossed through Muslim-controlled territories. Around 1118, a French knight named Hugh de Payne created a military order along with 8 relatives and acquaintances, calling it the Four Fellowship of the Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, later known as Knights Templar. The name, of course, comes from the temple, Solomon's temple that stood at one time and was destroyed 63 A.D. In Jerusalem. The knights were given special rights in 1139 by Pope Innocent II. Specifically, they were exempt from paying taxes, permitted to build their own oratories, and held to no one's authority but the Pope himself. And they were an important political force up until 1307. Because here's what happens, and here's where things get complicated for the knights. The knights were given grants of land by various noblemen. They were given gold by various noblemen. The knights couldn't keep the gold because, again, they had taken a vow of poverty. So they accumulated all of this wealth, and as far as I know from the records I've seen, they actually seemed to largely hold to it, and they had nothing to do with it. So they started loaning money. They started essentially creating some of the first. Them and a heresy known as the Waldensians are largely behind the modern banking system. Specifically, the Knights of Templar created the idea of deposits and to some extent the idea of a check. Because you could go to a Templar stronghold in Europe, for example, deposit money, gold with them, and they give you a receipt. You then would travel to the Middle East, for example, or another part of Europe, give the receipt to another stronghold of the Templars, and get your money back. And this is where their problem comes in. So you have this political figure, Philip IV, King Philip IV, aka King Philip the Fair. He was a French king. Philip IV had 2 major problems with the Templars. The first problem Philip has is that he owes them a lot of money. The second problem that Philip has is that they turned him down for membership. He's unhappy with both of these things, and he decides. He talks to the Pope. The Pope at the time doesn't agree with him, and that Pope dies. A new Pope is installed. There are, in fact, some rumors that he may have had the Pope executed. I can't say that for certain. And then finally, on Friday the 13th of October, 1307, scores of French Templars are arrested, including the Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay. They were tortured, as of course was common with these types of trials. They were tortured, and under torture they confessed to heresy, homosexuality, financial corruption, worshipping devils, spitting on the cross, practicing black magic. Supposedly, in fact, they learned magic from the Hashashim, which was an order of warriors in the Islamic world. The Hashashim are actually kind of interesting. They had a very mystical bent. In fact, they would go before they go in battle. They would take hashish. For anyone who doesn't know, it's a derivative of cannabis. So basically, it's a drug related to marijuana. And then they'd go into these frenzies and go kill people. Hashashim is also where English got the word assassin, if you can guess by the similarities. Um, and certainly the two orders knew of each other and had some political um, dealings with each other just because of the complex nature of politics in the Middle East. But the other one I find interesting, they were also accused of teaching women how to have abortions. Um, so anyway, they were burned at the stake in Paris for their confessions, and then Jacques de Molay himself was executed in 1314. King Philip put pressure on Pope Clement V, who dissolved the order in 1312. Its property and monetary assets were given to the Order of the Knights Hospitaller. And it's thought that Philip and King Edward II seized most of their actual wealth. And here's the thing, and this is pretty critical. It's very unlikely that most or even any of the charges against the Templars were factually true. Um, the reasons for their roundup and execution were greed and political corruption, and the fact that Philip was was in debt and wanted their money, and they had a lot of money. Um, their accusations are very bizarre. They're accused of worshiping a three-faced bearded demon known as Baphomet. This is a lot of where the image of the goat, of the famous goat faced devil, case in point, the statue you find in, I'm not going to look it up, but the statue that the Satanic Temple erected in protest to the Ten Commandments being placed at a courthouse. Um, there is no real evidence that the Templars worshipped anything other than Jesus Christ and the traditional Christianity. Um, the whole thing is largely a hoax. I should say the Knights Templar, while they officially ceased to exist in the early 14th century, there are groups that make the claim to being Templars now. Um, Particularly back in the 18th century, a number of groups, particularly the Freemasons, revived a number of their symbols, rituals, and traditions. There are organizations and people that claim to be Templars today. Public apparently can even join them. Representatives around the world claiming to uphold the values and traditions of the original medieval order. But I think another interesting one to talk about in this time period of history is the interesting situation of both Jeanne d'Arc and Giles de Rais. Because these are two particularly famous trials for witchcraft, one of which was undeniably innocent of any crimes. The other, there's a lot of debate about whether he did anything or not, which is another aspect of the trials I want to get into. That there are times that while the person wasn't guilty of the practice of saint devil worship, or at least probably wasn't, although there's enough evidence to suggest there were a few people that take up devil worship throughout Europe at various times. Um, Gilles de Rais may or may not have. So let me get into the story. So Jeanne d'Arc, of course, known to English speakers as Joan of Arc, was a French peasant girl who convinced the King of France that she had heard voices of several saints, including Saint Catherine, Saint Bernadette, and Saint Michael, telling her that God wanted the King of France, the rightful King of France, on the throne, and had sent her to ensure that this happened. Um, ironically, as most people know, she actually convinced him. As bizarre as the entire story says, sounded back then. She wasn't clergy. She wasn't a nun. She hadn't taken any kind of holy orders. She's just some unlettered peasant girl who shows up saying, "Yeah, God wants me to do this thing. Give me control of your armies." And she was giving command of the armies. And I personally find her quite a remarkable woman for the time, because she wound up leading armies from the front in armor. She did carry a sword, though there is no record anywhere of her ever using it. She herself denied that she used the sword. In fact, what she did instead of fighting, she carried the battle standard. The thing to realize is, armies, particularly Middle Ages, you carried a battle standard as a rallying point, and the person carrying it was a giant bullseye. Archers would aim for them. In fact, in Joan's first battle, she was shot in the neck with an arrow, and kept fighting. Um, that's pretty damn impressive. Um, and through her career, and she managed a number of very important wins. She worked with Gilles de Rais, who was eventually appointed the Field Marshal of France, basically the commander in chief. Regrettably, of course, she was eventually captured, and sold to the English by mercenaries, sold to the English, and put on the trial for the alleged crime of witchcraft. The trial records are something else. Again, she showed a great deal of intelligence for a peasant girl, and a fair degree of snark in the face of her own death. She was asked, what language do these voices speak?" Her response was, "A better one than yours." She was asked, and this is an example of her brilliance, they demanded of her to, "Are you in God's grace?" Now, the reason why that question is that question is problematic and her answer is so brilliant is, and this is something I wish modern Christianity would continue. At the time, it's a trick question, because if you say you're in God's grace, hey, Bess, glad to have you join us. But if you say you're in God's grace, that's hubris. How do you know that you're in God's grace? If you say no, well, we might as well set the Hindley on fire right now. You just admitted it. Joan's brilliant answer, which is pretty much the only good one that could have been given, was, "If I am in God's grace, I pray that He keep me there. If I am not in God's grace, I pray that He place me there." There was, there's no way to get her on that question. There's no hubris. She doesn't assume to know, but at the same time, she doesn't outright deny it. Um, and then she, of course, gets into further trouble because a big sticking point was the fact that she wore men's clothing. Now, while she was in prison, she originally agreed to wear women's clothes, and then went back to wearing men's clothing. The reason why this happened is that the jailers took her they threw her in with male prisoners, and the only clothing they'd allow her to wear was men's clothing. So her options were largely wear men's clothing or be raped. The examinations at the time, in her own testimony, stated that she was a virgin. So being raped would have been, and her virginity was very important to her, of course, as a devoutly religious woman. Her virginity, the idea of any woman being raped is absolutely horrible and despicable, but it would have been particularly horrific to her because she would have lost that chastity she valued so highly. So she put on the men's clothing, and they used it against her. Eventually, of course, she was burned at the stake, and then shortly thereafter, within a few years, they decided that the whole thing was a horrible mistake, and it was so she yeah, May 30th, 1431, at only 19 years of age, she was burned at the stake. Um, she, of course, has since been made a saint. She has seen highly become very highly respected, and in fact, she managed to change the tide of the Hundred Years' War and settle the fact that Charles VII, the king that she supported, would reconquer all of France except for Calais in 1453, and the English relinquished in 1558. In 1920, she was recognized by the Roman Catholic Church as a saint, and then her feast day is May the 30th. Um, I want to comment on this as well because I always find it interesting. Because there's a question I always ask myself, and I've heard other people ask. Uh, Beth says 1931. I'd have to open the webpage again. I did look it up, which is where I got the dates. I could certainly be wrong. But the question I've had before, and I've seen others ask, is why would God get involved in a political dispute between the English and French? Particularly because in reality, the complications of English law, it's actually more like the French against the French. Because a lot of the nobilities of England were of French descent. They spoke French. But why did God get involved? The first answer that came to my mind was the phrase "Hundred Years' War." Now, granted, the Hundred Years' War wasn't really one war that lasted 100 years so much as a series of wars combined together, where the English and French fought over who gets to rule France. Um, it doesn't seem completely impossible to me that God just said, "Okay, this needs to stop. Let's settle this," and knew that the French people were ultimately only really going to accept um, the French king in question. The Father Joseph Rose, the exorcist and priest I've talked about many times on this show, offered me an alternate suggestion that I believe has merit. The war, what Joan did ultimately was fight for the right of people to decide who rules them themselves. It was a question of would someone from English born from across you know rule France, or would the French have the king that they wanted? That idea, what she did, would go on to inspire revolutions around the world. Particularly, it was a major her act was an inspiration for both the American and the French Revolution. His point, and I think there's value to it, was that Joan's story helped bring the idea of freedom into the world. So that's Joan's story. Now we have Gilda Ray. Like I said, Gilda Ray was the Field Marshal of France. After all of this ends, eventually goes home, and stories start over time. He's eventually accused of devil worship. He's accused of being a child molester and a child murderer, um, of practicing alchemy, and supposedly had a book with the name of the devil that he would use to summon him. Um, he was eventually brought in on charges of witchcraft, and this is where things get confused. Um, the normal story is that when he was originally accused of witchcraft, he denounced the whole thing. He didn't claim innocence. He claimed that basically as a nobleman he was entitled to do whatever he wanted. How dare, particularly because his targets were peasants, not other nobles. So how dare anyone question his right to do with his peasants as they want? And then they threatened him with excommunication, and that's when he confessed. In most versions of his story I've heard, he was never tortured. More recently, I've been seeing a number of fairly credible sources saying that in fact he was tortured horribly, and under torture he confessed all of this. I don't know. There were certainly political reasons behind what was going on. People who wanted his, particularly, I believe, his relatives wanted his land. It sort of reminds me of another case, which would be Elizabeth Bathory's, where she was accused of torturing and engaging in lesbian acts with peasant girls. And historians have also argued that Elizabeth, or more properly, Elizabeth, was innocent of those charges. Um, Most historians, as I understand it, are of the opinion that she was guilty of some of her charges. They were probably exaggerated, again, for political reasons. She was very powerful. She owned a lot of land. She was not. Her husband had died by this point, so she, and issues with women and running things in the 16th century. Um, I don't know, but this does bring up a concept, and you run into this a lot with some of the medieval witch and even the later witch trials. That there are accusations of things that are objectively crimes, whether setting aside the whole question of, well, were they worshiping Satan? If you look at a lot of the stories from France, for example, there are stories of werewolves. There's the things a lot of people don't know is that aside from the execution of witches, werewolves were also burned at the stake um, as a witch, because basically it was believed that basically they were engaged in some kind of magic that allowed them to transform into beasts, or possibly create a delusion in their mind that they had transformed into a beast, or they were possessing an animal, um, something of this sort. There's a whole lot of questions. But a number of men in France were accused of witchcraft in the form of werewolfery and burned at the stake. And in particular, a lot of these men, I'm trying very hard to find the name of one of them because I can't remember off the top of my head. If you read the accounts, they sound. Here we go, werewolf witch trials. They should have what I'm looking for. Well, there's a whole other thing that I'll get into in a second with this because it's rather interesting. But Giles Garnier, I thought that was one of them. But the werewolf, also known as the Werewolf of Dole, he was a reclusive hermit living outside the town of Dole in Franche-Comté province of France. He had recently been married and moved his new wife to his isolated home. Being unaccustomed to feeding more than just himself, he found it difficult to provide for his wife, and discontent, which caused discontent between them. During the period, a number of children went missing, were found dead, and the authorities wound up accusing him of werewolfery. Um, Based on his confession and based on some other information, it has been speculated that basically what we're dealing with here, or another, is a serial killer. Or more specifically, in this case, that he was killing them, bringing the bodies back as food. There's Hans the Werewolf, 1651. He was accused of being a werewolf at 18. He confessed that he had hunted as a werewolf for 2 years and claimed to have gotten the body of the wolf by a man in black. Um, and there's a whole bunch of other things there, again, with his soul leaving the body. Um, and a number of questions that can be raised. And certainly, again, it's hard to know this far back, because we're talking about hundreds of years, whether these accusations had any truth to them or whether they were part of the issues at the time. Um, it's interesting to say as well, not everyone accused of witchcraft or werewolfery was executed. There's the case of Thiess, that's Thiess, um, happened in Livonia in 1692. But basically, this 80-year-old who confessed to being a werewolf claimed that he would go down to hell times a year to fight witches and wizards in the service of Satan to ensure a good harvest. If you're interested, there is on this channel, if you go back a long way, even we've been doing this for 4 years and this was in the first year or two, my original first co-host, Drew Rosansky, reading the transcript of his trial. But what you basically ran into, and this sort of trial happened a couple of times, is these men were brought in because they were telling people they were a werewolf. And the church was like, well, that's heresy. They're basically openly admitting to witchcraft. So the church sent an inquisitor out, the Roman Inquisition generally, and said, so are you a werewolf? Yes. Yes, I am. It's like, okay, that was easy. So you're in league with Satan? No, he can't stand me. Which confused the heck out of the witch hunter. And then explain this tradition. It's known by a couple of different names, but it's most famously probably called God's Hounds these days. They're also known as the Benindanti, particularly in Rome. You had the Benindanti, which were good walkers, and the Melindanti, which are evil walkers. Benindanti, good witch. Melindanti, evil witch. The witches steal the wood on the nights of the harvest, come up out of hell and steal the grain, drag it back to hell. And then these Benindanti, or these God's hounds, transformed into the shape of wolves. Again, usually, like I said, they actually took the form of spirit. Their soul left their body and took the form of a wolf. So, like an astral projection type of concept. And would go down to hell and fight the witches and fight the demons and bring it back. I know in the one case he was found completely innocent. In the other case, he was found guilty, sentenced to 40 lashes. And actually, I think it was Theus's case. He was sentenced to 40 lashes. And then the inquisitor said, yeah, we're not actually going to do that because you're 80. He was an extremely old man, and it probably would have killed him. So we're coming up on the end of the hour, and I may go a little over. But I want to talk about, so why did the witch hunts of the later part of the Middle Ages happen? What's going on here is actually a combination of factors. On the simplest level, you have an issue of changing power structures. Witch hunts became particularly common when the Protestant Reformation takes place. The Protestants and the Catholics are at odds with each other. Particularly, you find witch hunts in a number of Protestant countries because the Protestants take over. Catholic nuns no longer have a job because they've been kicked out of their convents and need something to do. A lot of them had experience as midwives. A lot of them had experience with herbalism and things of that nature. So they became wise women, and both because they're wise women, because they're on the social outcasts, almost pariahs, somewhat secretive, and of course they're Catholics, which the Protestants couldn't tolerate. They're accused of witchcraft. Certainly, the Catholics are by no means innocent. They also killed people of witchcraft. But there's a whole other issue that's going on at the time that people aren't necessarily widely aware of, which is an ice age. Believe it or not, it's known as let me look up the time period. So the Little Ice Age. It's a period of cooling that occurred after the medieval warm period. Well, it's not actually a true ice age. It was called such by Francois E. Mathes in 1939. It has been defined as a period from the 16th to 19th century, although other people have argued that it ran from about 1300 to 1850. The NASA Earth Observatory notes three particular cold periods: 1650, 1770, and last in 1850, separated by periods of slight warming. So here's what happens. In Europe, the tradition was that the king was responsible for the land not just in a literal sense, but in a mystic sense. If the king was right with God, the land prospered, the crops grew, the animals thrived and reproduced. If the king angers God, that stops. Crops are blighted, livestock dies, game that you can hunt for becomes scarce. Animals, Wolves and things like that are normally fairly docile become more violent. So again, 14th century, maybe later 16th, 17th, Earth goes into a cooling period, particularly in Europe. Crops start failing because of this. Livestock are dying, and wild animals get driven a little nuts because of the bizarre temperature changes. People become angry. People want somebody to blame. If the health of the land is tied to the king's relationship with God, it's the king's fault. Riots start happening, revolutions start happening. The royalty, and by consequence the church, because remember, the church is very much, then and now realistically, is very much a political entity, are being threatened. Their power is at stake. Their ability to maintain order is at stake. They need a scapegoat. And now, if you look at the legends of witches in the time period, and even earlier, witches are supposed to be able to control the weather. Witches strike down livestock. Witches change the shape of wild animals and attack people. Again, the whole werewolf thing. Witches become a convenient scapegoat for the disaster for an ecological disaster that was really nobody's fault. There are other issues at stake, and again, what causes witch trials very much depends on where you're talking about, what time period you're talking about. But the thing to realize, and this will shock a lot of people, of the witch trials, through the hundreds of years they took place, 30% of them ended in execution. Most of the time, witches were banished. They were in prison. They were fined. They weren't actually killed at all, as often. Particularly what you would run into if a witch confesses. Well, she confessed. She's eligible to be redeemed. You let her live. You throw her in jail, take away all her property. She refuses to confess. Then you gotta burn her at the stake. It's the only way to save her soul. But again, even then, a lot of times they're just simply thrown out. There's a story coming up I always enjoy of the Pennsylvania witch trial that was overseen by William Penn, which is a good example of this. But these again are the kind of concepts you're looking at here. We have definitely gone up over the hour, so I'm going to be wrapping things up shortly, I think. We will be continuing next week and looking at more modern trials. But I want to wrap up with at least this time period so that we can get into the Salem witch trials, which are a whole different kettle of fish. But also not largely for religious reasons. But that's the thing. But again, that's a common theme you'll see here is that very often witch hunts come out of a sense of a need to establish political control. People are revolting. The peasants are furious and blaming all their problems on the royalty and nobility. Burn some witches. Even going back to the first century and the persecution of the Christians under the Roman emperors that did so. Well, why were they executed? It wasn't generally speaking for not worshiping the emperors so much as refusing to acknowledge a concern they weren't refusing, because the reality is the Jews also didn't worship the Roman emperors and weren't at that time in the same time period weren't generally being as heavily persecuted. They were in other time periods, but the situation you run into is that the Christians were seen as threatening the Roman stability, particularly because it became popular at times in the Roman army. And this idea that there's only one God and you only have to acknowledge and worship one God. It threatens the political power structure of Rome. They become a scapegoat. they become somebody that they need to get rid of. It's generally true that a lot of the violence that gets um, blamed on religion. Well, this isn't to say there isn't a religious component. A lot of the times, they're more complicated. It's not as simple as God made me do it. There are political and economic reasons why these things go on. Though this is off topic, the crusade, particularly the first crusade, is a really good example of this. It's the reasons for the first crusade were actually very politically justifiable. Real briefly, because again it's off topic, but essentially what happens is that the keep in mind, for one, that the Muslim, and this also goes into the Inquisition and its role in Spain. The Muslims started invading Europe in the 7th century, in Spain and Italy particularly, and continued to, Islamic Muslims and Christians continue to have issues with each other for started long before the First Crusade, ended long after the First Crusade. Arguably, some of the last major aggression of the Islamic empires would be the act, aside from modern, and I'm not talking about extremism, modern day extremism, but the actions of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, particularly the genocide against the Armenians, most of whom were Christian. But again, and even on the Islamic side of it, there are reasons other than religion that are going into what was going on. Yes, there were territory disputes going on between the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantium, and the Muslims. There was also an issue that Christian pilgrims were having, that a lot of con artists were passing through, claiming to be pilgrims and causing problems, and Muslims trying to deal with that wound up accidentally killing innocent pilgrims, and the whole thing becomes an issue. It's a complex political situation. But the original reason for the crusade wasn't the first crusade. Again, later crusades are a whole other kettle of fish. But was a request for aid to the Pope sent by the Emperor of the Byzantine Empire, along with legitimate issues that pilgrims were experiencing during their travels. This doesn't excuse all of the extremes that some of the Crusaders got into and all the things of that nature, but it does make it simpler than black and white. Okay, we've gone past the hour mark at this point, which is okay, particularly since I started a little late. Folks, I want to thank you for tuning in. Remember to tune in next week when we'll be getting further into this and starting with the Salem witch trials, and then getting into the McCarthyism and the Red Scare, and particularly getting into the Satanic Panic and modern witch trials going around on in other parts of the world, and the danger of another witch hunt. One thing Lisa for Truth talks about in her videos, and I completely agree with her, there are elements that have led to witch trials in the past that are cropping up in society today. This is, the old saying, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. We're kind of starting to see what happens because people have forgotten. But that's about it for tonight, folks. If you enjoy what I'm doing, if you want to support me, please consider subscribing. Also shoot me a like, shoot me a comment. Tell me what you think of what I've said and what I'm doing. If you like me, please tell me so. If you hate me and think I'm a total idiot, feel free to tell me that as well. My only rule, and Bess, thank you for your comment about great talk. My only rule with comments I want people to keep in mind is you can insult me, you can call me an idiot, you can call me fat, because let's face it, I am. Do not use racial slurs. Do use homophobic slurs. Otherwise, and try to keep the profanity to a minimum. Otherwise, have at it. I'll also point out, again, we're filming in my apartment. I'm sitting at my dining room table at the moment. This is not an ideal space. You may have noticed I'm missing a pair of hosts. Sound quality isn't as good. Video isn't as good. We can go back. We still have a potential to go back to the studio. The reality is I need $300 or more a month to do that, and I can't afford it anymore. If you can, and if you have a little money to spare and you're feeling charitable, look at the description. Patreon.com/demonology, patreon.com/demonology. Throw me a couple of bucks. We do have some rewards in there. If you can, again, liking, commenting, and subscribing also of enormous help. Um, if you haven't seen it yet, there is a video on this channel called Curse of the Wings. One, we made a promise that when we hit 500 subscribers, Baron Voltage, aka Christopher Ryan, one of my two co-hosts, was going to do the Hot Wings challenge live on air. It took till 590 subscribers because unfortunately his work schedule changed. But the man was good to his. We were good to our word. He did do the Hot Wings challenge on air. You could see it. I suggested it's hilarious. I'll also mention if we hit 1,000, I'm doing the show in an evening gown. Although I may start, if we get close to 1,000, maybe I'll start a poll and it's like, do you want me to do it in the evening? Get me to 1,000, I'll do it in the evening. Or there you go. Just put it in the comments. Should it be a promise or a threat that if we get to 1,000, I'll do it in the evening gown, or if we don't get to 1,000 soon enough, I will do it in the evening gown. I personally kind of favor the evening gown because it's more I think it'll be more entertaining. But let me know what you think in the comments. But again, thanks for tuning in. Do check out Lisa for Truth. She has a number of great videos about the Satanic Panic, which you are definitely building to. And a number of interesting videos and a bunch of other religious topics. I wouldn't say I agree with everything she has to say, but she's a very intelligent woman. She has a good head on her shoulders, a lot of good things to say. I also recommend checking out my friend Source the Skeptics channel. Like I said, we may be working on a collaboration sometime in the near future. He's a really good guy. He has a lot of good comments. He's an atheist, but he's right. He and I agree more often than not. Steve McRae also has a really good channel. He's got some cool things coming out. So I recommend checking what he's doing. But that's going to do it for tonight. Thank you all for tuning in. This is Kevin saying good night and God bless.